Species. Unite.
We may think that we're just eating our dinner tonight, but when you multiply it by all of that food every day of the year, everyone in the country, everybody in the world, it's a tremendous production. Just to give you a sense, in the US, we slaughter about 18,000 animals every minute for food, just in the United States. So I can't even calculate how many animals have been slaughtered in slaughterhouses in the United States just since we started this podcast.
Hi, I'm Elizabeth Novogratz. This is Species Unite. We have a favor to ask. If you like today's episode and you have a spare minute, could you please rate and review Species Unite on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen to podcasts? It really helps people to find the show. Agriculture and our food system are responsible for about a third of greenhouse gas emissions. Yet, the food system gets left out of many climate conversations, and the industry is rarely held accountable. So I asked Peter Lehner to come on the show and explain what agriculture's role is in climate and how and why they're so often left off the hook. Peter's one of the leading experts on the impact of agriculture and climate change. He directs Earth Justice's Sustainable Food and Farming Program, developing litigation, administrative, and legislative strategies to promote a more just and environmentally sound agriculture system and to reduce health, environmental, and climate harms from the production of our food. He's also the author of Farming for Our Future, the Science, Law, and Policy of Climate-Neutral Agriculture, and he teaches at Columbia and Yale Law Schools. Peter, it's awesome to be here. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Beth. It's great to be here on your great show.
Thank you. I'm so excited. We are here to talk about something that is so astronomically important, yet so not talked about enough. And that is big ag and climate. The two are rarely used. I mean, they're getting more used, I guess, but they're still rarely used in the same sentence. I think just to start, I would love to talk about how agriculture contributes to climate change.
Let's start with the bottom line. Agriculture and our food system drive about a third of climate change or more, which means that even if we are very successful, as we have to be, in decarbonizing energy and buildings and transportation, we still face catastrophic climate change unless we deal with the food system. So that's why it is so important. I think the challenge is that when most people think about climate change, they think about burning fossil fuels, coal or oil, and they vaguely know that that releases carbon dioxide, which is a greenhouse gas, and that's bad and causes climate change. There's some of that in agriculture. It uses a fair amount of energy, and actually agricultural chemicals like pesticides and fertilizers are some of the biggest markets for petrochemicals. But most of agriculture's contribution to climate change is very, very different from that. And so it just doesn't register for people. And perhaps the most amazing part of this is that agriculture's contribution to climate change comes from, well, you can simplify it, comes from cows, corn, and crap. So cows, start there. Cows have different guts than you and I have. And so they can eat grass, but they belch methane, which is a very potent greenhouse gas, 80 times more powerful than carbon dioxide. Every breath, they breathe out methane. You and I don't do that. And that source of methane is actually the biggest source of methane in the planet. Cow belching produces more methane than the oil and gas sector. Cows also eat a lot, and they poop a lot. And there's a vast amount of manure. The animals in this country produce about 20 or 30 times more waste than all the humans do. And unlike human waste, you can think of sewage treatment plants and careful septic systems. Animal waste is just kept in these big pits and then spread on the ground. And when that is done with it, it also releases a lot more methane, the same very potent greenhouse gas, and also nitrous oxide, which is another very potent greenhouse gas. So that's the cows and the crap. And then, as I said, they eat a lot. Most of what they eat is actually the grain that is produced on hundreds of millions of acres of land, which is heavily fertilized with nitrogen fertilizer that is often not fully used up by the plants. And as a result, some of it washes out, and probably many of your readers have heard of water pollution problems from nitrates, and whether it be the dead zone in the Gulf of Mexico or algae blooms in lakes and rivers. But it also goes up into the atmosphere as nitrous oxide, this potent greenhouse gas. So that is another driver, and that's what I think of as corn, because corn is the most heavily fertilized crop. So that the cows, corn, and the crap release tremendous amounts of very powerful greenhouse gases. There's also some fossil fuels, as I said, in agrochemicals and tractors and ventilation fans and the like. So there's some carbon dioxide. And then the last way agriculture contributes to climate change is even harder for most people to grasp. It's the fact that it uses most of our land. In the US, agriculture uses almost 2/3 of the contiguous US. Think about if you've ever driven around or flown and looked out the window. What do you see? You see agriculture changing our landscape. And the fact that agriculture is using that land means that land is not, say, native forest or native grassland. And all of those native lands had a lot more carbon in them. Healthy soils in forests or grasslands have tremendous amounts of carbon. When they're dug up and converted to a cornfield or a soy field or wheat field or cattle grazing area, they lose all of that carbon, or almost all of that carbon. And they lose the ability to keep drawing carbon from the atmosphere the way healthy forests and grasslands do. So you have all of these ways that agriculture drives climate change, with the result that it has this impact about the same as our transportation system. But while everybody understands that cars stuck on the freeway are bad for climate change, nobody realizes that the animals, particularly the rest of our food system, is driving just as much climate change.
And why do you think, I mean, I know it's not what you think. Why is that? It just doesn't even occur to people. It's not even in the zeitgeist.
I think there's 2 or 3 reasons. One reason is, as I said, it just comes about in a different way. It's not burning fossil fuels, carbon dioxide, it's cow belching. How bad can that be? It's fertilizer. How bad can that be? Well, the answer is, from a climate perspective, it can be pretty bad. The other reason is that the industrial agriculture lobby has done a tremendous job and poured hundreds of millions of dollars trying to make sure nobody knows about it. It's not a coincidence that many of your listeners may not know about this. They lobby very hard to get exemptions from almost all the environmental laws so that they don't even have to report their greenhouse gas emissions, let alone do anything about them. So whereas other companies, everyone can easily get access to, say, the greenhouse gas emissions from Exxon. It's very, very hard to get that information from any food company or from any meat production or any large grain company. They don't have to report it, and they do their best to keep it secret. And then when they do report it, the third reason, they often, let's say, stretch the truth or misrepresent that. So when big meat companies are claiming, don't worry, we're going to have zero carbon impact by 2040 or 2050, and again, spend millions of dollars trying to peddle that image, that's factually untrue and very misleading to consumers. But there's not a strong voice on the other side saying, whoa, 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 that's not correct. And so it's complicated in the first instance. They're spending lots of money to keep it secret, and what is said about it is often misleading.
How do they get away with this? Is this always how it's been, since these conversations started?
Well, of course, climate conversations are in the big scheme of things, relatively new in the last 20 or 30 years. But actually, agriculture has been exempt from environmental oversight laws for 150 years. It's really remarkable to go back in history in the United States. And as early as the late 1800s, there are studies that show that already, for example, there's vast overgrazing in the Western lands, and calls for doing something about this to prevent the degradation of this new land that is being opened up. And that went nowhere. Agriculture was exempt from the major antitrust laws in the early part of the 1900s. And in the in the 30s, there was other efforts to try to rein in agriculture's environmental impact. Every time people looked, it was this tremendous environmental impact. And by and large, time and again, it went nowhere. So in 1970, when the major Clean Air, Clean Water Acts were passed, wonderful laws that have helped us make tremendous progress cleaning up our air and water from industrial sources, they really don't address agriculture very well. They either explicitly exempt agriculture or cover them in a very, frankly, largely ineffective way. And of course, while other laws, when you see a problem, can sometimes get amended to try to fix them, industrial agriculture's lobby is so powerful that every effort to improve the Clean Air Act or the Clean Water Act to address some of this pollution has been unsuccessful. And then lastly, the Farm Bill, which is amended frequently, also is largely subsidies to farmers rather with very little oversight. So there's not the same, it's not a regulatory statute like the Clean Air and Clean Water Act. So you put all that together and it's 150 years of agriculture's growing environmental impact, or I should say growing awareness of industrial agriculture's significant environmental impact, and yet ineffective efforts at oversight.
So it's no rules almost. They've had very few rules. And in fact, recently you filed lawsuits against JBS and Tyson. Will you talk about that and what they're for?
Sure. Well, we started with JBS, which is the world's largest meat company, also the U.S. largest beef company. And we brought an action in front of what's called the National Advertising Division of the Better Business Bureau. It's really an industry self-regulatory body. And we said their claim that they would achieve net zero emissions. In other words, they would somehow get their emissions down so low and then balance them off with things that are sucking up carbon from the air that their net is zero by 2040. And we heard this and thought that's pretty much impossible for a beef company to do because, as I said, cows are belching methane. There may be some things you can feed them to reduce that a little bit, but cows belch methane. They eat a lot. They poop a lot. There are real challenges to reducing these emissions, and they're vast. The emissions of JBS are equivalent to the country of Spain. So these are not small companies. So they said that, and they're advertising to the consumers. And of course, consumers, to their credit, are beginning to try to buy products that align with their values. And a lot of consumers care about the climate. And so they want to think about, I want to buy climate friendlier food. And so in a sense, they're sitting ducks to advertising that says, oh, my meat is climate friendly, or don't worry, we're going to take care of this. And so we asked the National Advertising Division to look into this, and they agreed with us that their claims were misleading. And I think it's important to emphasize the National Advertising Division is industry self-regulatory. So this is the advertising industry itself recognizing that truthful advertising is important for business. It's important for businesses that are trying to do the right thing. It's important for consumers. So this is not just an environmental group saying this. This is the advertising industry agreeing that misleading advertising is not a good thing, and these claims were misleading. JBS continued to make those claims. So now the New York Attorney General has brought a lawsuit against them. And if the New York Attorney General succeeds, they'll be able to get a court order forcing JBS to stop making these claims and get penalties and the like. So that case is moving forward now. Not so long ago, Earth Justice and other organizations represented Environmental Working Group and made a similar claim against Tyson Food, which is also claiming they're going to be net zero by 2050 in this case, not 2040, and that they're already producing climate smart beef, climate friendly beef. And so the lawsuit alleges the same thing, that Tyson, first of all, doesn't even has not announced a full accounting of its emissions, does not, or at least certainly has not announced or presented any plan for getting those emissions down to anything close to zero, and certainly is taking no steps in that direction. And yet they want consumers now to say, oh, I feel good about, I'll buy Tyson product, I'll pay a premium for Tyson product because of something that they are promising will happen in 25 years. And hopefully the court will agree with us that this is also misleading.
I mean, in order for them to get to net zero, they basically would have to stop animal agriculture, right? Like,
it's pretty hard to see, perhaps stop, not necessarily stop, but dramatically reduce.
Right.
Because as I said, it's cows' biology is to belch methane. And there are some feed additives out there that can reduce the methane they belch by maybe 10% or so. And there's some research into vaccines that maybe we can give them to cows and they'll belch a little less methane. But that's still a little bit less from a very, very high amount that they are belching now. And as I said, also, they eat a lot, and that is grain. And when we put fertilizer onto crops, right now, about half of that fertilizer is taken up by the crop and half goes into the water or the air. And there's all sorts of ways we can improve that. But most estimates are still that you're going to get it maybe to 75% at best of the fertilizer would be used by the crop. So you still have a lot running off and into the atmosphere. So in other words, it's pretty hard to imagine how we're going to, or a company would eliminate that. Cattle need a lot of room to graze. And right now that just takes a lot of land and there's no way around that. And the way they handle manure is, again, would require dramatic shifts in how they handle all that crap.
And the way they handle manure now with the big cesspools of manure.
These big pits, they just sit there and fester for a while, and then they spread it on land, where again, it releases both odors, which can sometimes be pretty annoying for the neighbors, and it also releases more of these greenhouse gases. So you need massive changes to really significantly reduce the greenhouse gas emissions from these big meat companies. We calculated that if JBS's emissions, if they were able to reduce their emissions by 75%, which is probably physically impossible right now and in the foreseeable future, they would still need to offset the remaining emissions. The remaining emissions are so big, they would have to offset those. And right now, most people think of offsets by saying, okay, we'll plant trees and preserve trees or something. They would need an area we calculated about the size of the state of Virginia to offset just the remaining 25% of their emissions. So I think one thing that's important for example, your listeners to understand is the scale of these operations. We may think that we're just eating our dinner tonight, but when you multiply it by all of that food every day of the year, everyone in the country, everybody in the world, it's a tremendous production. Just to give you a sense, in the US, we slaughter about 18,000 animals every minute for food, just in the United States. I can't even calculate how many animals have been slaughtered in slaughterhouses in the United States just since we started this podcast. But that gives perhaps a sense of the scale that we're talking.
And the majority of animals slaughtered in the United States come from industrial farming.
Virtually all of it. And most of that will be chickens, but a lot of swine and cattle as well.
But there's very little old-timey small farms.
Yeah.
That everyone likes to say, oh no, I only eat my meat from these.
I think the numbers are there's a couple million farms in the U.S., according to the U.S. Census of Agriculture. Of those, about half are farms that people have really more for lifestyle or for tax purposes. They can be very important for the community, and they maybe produce a little bit of food for the community. But it's a very small number of farms that produce almost all of our food. And those are these ginormous animal factories that produce the chicken, the beef, the pork, and the milk, really. All come from these big operations. We're talking 95% plus of what is produced comes from these industrial scale operations.
And so the audacity for these guys to come out and say, oh, we're going to be net zero. Oh, we're going to be climate friendly companies and sell climate friendly meat, et cetera. It's audacity and it's lies, but they've also kind of been protected for decades and allowed to lie and cover up, right? Will you talk about the lobbyists and the big ag lobbies a little bit, how this has all gone down?
What's frustrating, of course, is if these companies had to report their greenhouse gas emissions like many other companies, then they wouldn't be able to say what they're going to do with such freedom, because there'd be something to check it against. And so these companies are able to misrepresent what's going on and to make misleading statements to consumers because there isn't government reporting, isn't mandated reporting. And it's important to understand that in most other sectors of the economy, the first step is reporting. Let's just get an understanding of what the pollution is. And if you think about it, we're now focusing on greenhouse gases, but animal agriculture in particular is also a major source of toxic emissions like ammonia and hydrogen sulfide. Ammonia, everyone knows, is a pretty strong, nasty smell, and indeed in intense concentrations can kill people. Animal agriculture is the biggest source of ammonia in this country. Ammonia also, when it gets into the air, converts into what's called PM 2.5, which means very, very small particulate matter, which gets into our lungs and causes a whole series of cardiovascular disease. So this is not greenhouse gas emissions we're talking. We're talking, as it were, what you may think of as good old-fashioned pollution that kills people right away. And in fact, agriculture is responsible for about 17,000 premature deaths every year. Now, it kills 17,000 people a year from air pollution, which at this point is more people than, say, coal-fired power plants are responsible for.
Like 17,000 people who work in it, or people who live near it, or
largely people who will work in, live near, or otherwise affected by largely, I say animal agriculture, really industrial agriculture, but most of the pollution comes from industrial scale animal production. If any of your listeners maybe have driven in California, say across the San Joaquin Valley, you go from, say, San Francisco to Yosemite and you cross the valley, and that valley, which is heavily agricultural, has got some of the worst air in the country. And that's because agriculture is, and in large part animal agriculture, these enormous dairies and other operations there are causing this pollution. So we think of air pollution, toxic air pollution, as, say, a refinery or a big factory or something. But actually, the Clean Air Act has done a pretty good job requiring those to clean up. Not perfect, which is why the organization I'm at, Earth Justice, still pushes hard for cleaner standards for a lot of folks and for a lot of facilities, and for people who live right near a factory or a power plant or a refinery. We still have a long way to go, but we've made progress there. Whereas respect to animal agriculture, we really haven't made progress. And in fact, since these laws started, animal agriculture has changed. It used to be the type of farm that you mentioned, maybe a small farm with a handful of animals and a variety of crops and all. That was certainly in the mind of Congress in 1970 and was more the norm. That's not where our food comes from now. There may still be those little farms that you can see, and they're lovely, and they can be really important for a local community and for some local foods. But most of our food, 95% of our food, doesn't come from those.
Right.
I think what you see is that the industrial agriculture lobby is very powerful for a number of reasons. One is almost every state has an important agriculture sector to their economy. So it's not like, say, oil and gas, where you may have a few states where oil and gas is really important, but lots of states where it's less important as an industry. Agriculture is important in many, many states. And, in all of these states, agriculture is, some states like Nebraska, agriculture uses 95% of the land. And in lots of other states, even in California, it's 55% of the land. But that's part of the reason it has this huge political power, because it's not just oil states like Texas and Louisiana. It's every frickin' state. Second, it tends actually not to be as partisan. In the representatives from Democratic states or Democratic members can often be very concerned about industrial agriculture as well. It's also got a history. The US and other countries have an agrarian past. And so we have this myth of the cowboy, the myth of the farmer. And right now, as a matter of where our food comes from, it's a myth. But it is still a powerful story. It's a powerful identification that people have. We want to protect the American farmer. And of course, we should be concerned about our food supply, and we should be concerned about people who are working the land. But the way the myth carries forward is really very different from the way most of our land is managed, the way most of our animals are produced. And so that is something that the animal agriculture industrial lobby takes advantage of, that people have this idea in their minds of where our food comes from, which is not factually true, even if it may have been historically true 200 years ago. And they do their best to make sure that that's still what people think. And then when you think about that, you don't need laws to control that. We shouldn't be hammering them. We shouldn't be requiring more. They're natural stewards of the land. And I think some farmers really are natural stewards of their land, and they deserve a lot of credit. But again, that's not where most of our food comes from.
And this is just a total aside, but I was reading yesterday, there was an article in Time by Peter Singer about why Europe and the UK have such better animal welfare laws in farms. And one of his, the ideas behind it is we don't care as much because we still have the cowboy mentality. And so it doesn't matter how rough you handle your animals. And the cowboy thing is a weird American thing. And it's not even a true thing, right?
Myths are very powerful.
Yeah. And they really let people get away with a lot.
Right. And if you think about the advertising, it is very much trying to push those myths. And I should say the advertising is also not an accident. The US has a system called the checkoff programs. So under federal law, most of the agriculture sectors have to pay into a fund. So, for example, $1 a head of cattle goes into this cattle checkoff program, or a certain amount per hundredweight of milk or per pork or chicken goes into a fund. And that fund is supposedly run by the government, but it's largely actually implemented by the trade association. So, for example, the National Cattlemen's Beef Association gets to use most of their money. And by statute, this money, this essentially government-mandated advertising fund, is to increase consumption of whether it be chicken or milk or pork or cat or beef or whatever. And so those ads, which are hundreds of millions of dollars a year if you add this all up, are peddling this image. You'll see them. They're always the picture of the lovely family farmer that is very appealing. It's not actually how most of our food is produced, but it's a very appealing image. And there's hundreds of millions of dollars of advertising, government mandated, that gets us there.
It's nostalgic and
Exactly.
completely, and everyone falls for it.
I would add on the checkoff, there have been some interesting lawsuits. We have not been involved. Others have brought them by independent ranchers, for example, saying this advertising, which really helps the industrial scale operations, doesn't help us. And we don't like being forced to pay into this fund that supports industrial scale agriculture as opposed to the sort of small, more sustainable agriculture that we practice. Unfortunately, so far, those cases have not been that successful. So most of the advertising really is supporting the industrial scale agriculture, not the type of agriculture that we may all want to be the source of our food.
That's unreal that they have to pay for it. And it's actually hurting them in the long run, right?
Yeah.
Wow. So we know how bad it is. So how does this change? We're going to be feeding 10 billion people soon. And yes, we know all the things we should be doing.
Well, I think it is important to look at how we think about the transformation of the energy sector as a model. And I think of that in part because I've worked in that area for 30 years before I more recently started focusing the last decade on agriculture. And what did we do and are we still doing in energy? One is energy efficiency. We try to use a lot less energy, but still get the services we want. So a LED light bulb uses 10% the energy of the old incandescent bulb. A good refrigerator now uses 20% of the energy of an old refrigerator, but it's bigger and fancier and does all sorts of cool things as well, but uses a fraction of the energy. A car gets 40 miles to the gallon rather than when I was a kid growing up, your car would get 10 miles to the gallon. And of course, with electric vehicles, even better. So one is use a lot less of it. And that means use it efficiently and don't waste it. We try not to, for example, air condition with our doors open. So we talk about insulating homes. So we're not heating and cooling the great outdoors. The second area we've done that in energy is we try to improve the existing grid. There's a lot of losses on the grid and the lines. We can clean up coal plants to be more efficient and gas plants to be a little bit better, et cetera. And the third area is we shift to clean energy, solar and wind primarily, which just don't generate greenhouse gases. So you get electricity without that. In the food system right now, we're really only talking about that second one. We're trying to take existing production methods, the equivalent to the coal plant or the oil plant or the gas plant, and trying to make them a little bit better. And I think in that area, we can probably do better with agriculture, that system, make a bigger difference. There's a lot of things a farmer can do or landowner can do to reduce the emissions of nitrogen oxide. You can, from fertilizer. There are things, even if you manage manure, you can manage manure in ways that release a lot less methane. So there are, and you can add trees to crops and to pastures, and that would absorb a tremendous amount of carbon. So there are things you can do to take our existing system and make it a lot cleaner. But how about those two other parts? The part of, say, clean energy. What can we do? If you think about the equivalent of solar and wind, the question for us is, how do we get clean, healthy nutrition? And given that about 80% of agriculture's climate footprint comes from animals, and most significantly beef, much more so than from pork or chicken, inherently clean nutrition will be a lot more plant-based. And there are dozens and dozens of studies that make that crystal clear. Let's be more plant-based. Let's use our land and our resources more efficiently to get healthier, more sustainable nutrition, just like renewable energy. And that's basically gets more of our energy, our nutrition energy, from plants, just like we're getting more of our electric energy from solar and wind. And then there's the last part, which is let's use it more efficiently. Let's not waste. And now we waste 40% of the food we produce. And that's waste that is causing lots of troubles at the beginning and at the end. It's at the end, we dump the food waste in a landfill and it rots and produces more methane, which again is this potent greenhouse gas. But we also we spend a lot of water and land and energy and fertilizer and greenhouse gas emissions producing food that then gets to wasted. So trying not to waste our food is another critical piece of that. And when we then say, well, but there's food insecurity, we're going to have more people to feed. What about that? The answer is that's a distribution question, not a how much food. If we're wasting 40% of the food, the fact that people are going hungry is not a question of that we're not producing enough. We're just not getting it to them. Our structure of distribution and of pricing and of food is not where it needs to be. So when you ask what can we do, the answer is we want to do as much as we can with our existing production, make it a whole bunch better than it is now. And there are programs to encourage that. The Inflation Reduction Act provided lots of money for farmers to adopt practices that will really clean up what they're now doing. But we have to think more broadly. Not just that, also think about inherently clean nutrition, which is going to be more plants generally, and a lot less waste.
I want to talk about two of them. First, the plants.
Okay.
So, yes, I agree with you that we should be eating a whole lot more plants. But in terms of individual versus big picture, because we need both, right? And how do we shift the big picture? Like how do we make plants more accessible, available, the default versus meat 3 meals a day is kind of the default in America, right? But we eat so much meat, it's insane compared to the rest of the world.
It's a great question, and it's often assumed that that is just the way it should be or the way it's always been. And it's certainly historically not the way it's always been. And there are many things that we do to encourage that. If you go to a restaurant menu, for example, all the restaurant, frankly, wants you to eat more meat because they can charge more for that. So those are most of the menu items. What is served at dining halls or whatever is often the default. Here's your option. If you don't like it, you can ask for something else. And there have been studies that show that if instead you make a plant-based option the default, people can still ask for meat, but they find the plant-based option just fine most of the time. And in fact, that changes what people eat. So there's these what are called nudges that you can do. What is the default? Where do we list it? How do we list it? Et cetera. There's also follow the money. Right now, our system supports meat production tremendously. The feed animals, as I keep saying, they eat a lot. That feed is very, very heavily subsidized. So that essentially is a subsidy to meat because it takes 15 pounds of grain, say, to get a pound of beef. So any subsidy for that grain is a huge subsidy for beef. There are also indirect subsidies. For example, we know that this agriculture system, as it is now, the industrial agriculture pollution, for example, is causing tens of billions of dollars of cost to drinking water providers. So that drinking water providers all around the country have to spend the money to clean up their water so it's safe to drink. Letting them pollute and passing that cost onto the drinking water provider is essentially a subsidy to the meat industry. And so if you add all of this up, and it hasn't been done that well yet. There have been various studies that suggest that if you would really look at, say, a pound of meat, it wouldn't cost $5. I think there was a recent article that said, and like the $5, it would really be $15. I've seen other studies that would say it would actually be $30. And this is quite real. these analyses are not just done by, say, environmental NGOs who want to badmouth beef. These are done by the Rockefeller Foundation or by the top accounting firms or consulting firms, and are realizing that the agriculture industry has a tremendous externalities. What are these pollution impacts that are being put on other people, so that the market price of food is a fraction of the real price of food. So going back to the question of what can be done at the big scale, if we stop subsidizing meat so much more than we subsidize other types of food, if, say, we just subsidized all food equally, you'd have a vastly different price structure, and that would make a big difference. And then lastly, of course, and there's a battle going on right now about the dietary guidelines. For purely health reasons, the advisory committee has suggested that Americans eat more plants and vegetables and more fruits and vegetables and eat less meat. And the meat industry is not happy about that. Purely health-based. And again, health is something that all of us pay for in our health insurance, whether it be at work or through the government or anything else. So the idea that we are encouraging people to eat in a way that is not healthy, and then we pay for their medical bills, we as taxpayers, is sort of crazy. So again, it's interesting that there are some very conservative groups that are suggesting that we really revisit these farm subsidies, because we are subsidizing environmental destruction, we're subsidizing bad health, and that is not what we should be doing with taxpayer money.
But do you see this changing anytime in the near future in terms of subsidies? Do you think it has a chance?
Well, I think your podcast is part of the change, is getting more people to understand that this is something we should be talking about, which is why I was so glad when you called, because if people understood that we have to address agriculture to address climate change, and if likewise people understand we have to address our food subsidies to address health, there would be more pressure for that. But right now, lawmakers and policymakers don't hear from people. The farm system, the laws that surround the farms, the most important one is called the Farm Bill, which is reauthorized by Congress roughly every 5 years, is largely something that the industrial agriculture lobby pays a lot of attention to. And yet it has a big impact on what all of us eat. And yet does every eater say to their policymaker, hey, the Farm Bill is up this year. Make sure you have a farm bill that is really good for those of us who eat, and those of us who breathe, and those of us who pay our taxes. And yet, by and large, policymakers don't hear from anybody but the current folks who are doing best under the Farm Bill, the industrial agriculture.
Well, and most people, I don't think, have ever even heard of the Farm Bill, or if
Right.
they had, they just went in and out of their head.
Right.
Right.
But if they thought about it, they might understand, and that's why I'm so glad about this podcast. They might now think about this. They might understand that, well, look at this food that I'm eating. There's probably some government support here. This doesn't just happen. And by the way, the food system is amazing. If you just think about, say, one meal you have, you might have had a cup of coffee that could come from any number of different countries far away. You might have had, maybe a roll or a muffin or something like that, which comes from wheat or other grains that could be from a dozen different states in the United States, had many stages before it became the roll on your plate. You could get a vegetable, some maybe from California, some could have been a local vegetable, some could be from the South, much could be imported elsewhere. If you had some meat, that could be from anywhere in the United States, and it gets to your plate. So it's an amazingly complicated system that is dependent on so many levels of government support. And just a moment's thought about that perhaps will get people to then think, wow, maybe we can shape that government support so it's a little better for the eaters as well as the rest of us.
Okay, the one other thing I wanted to talk about, which is not really anything we just talked about, but very connected, and I think very much part of your past work especially, because a lot of our audience is very pro-wildlife and pro-wolf and pro-grizzly bear and wild horses. And
As they should be.
Yes. I mean, I hope most people are pro all this, but in fact, they are not. But will you talk about how agriculture and why agriculture has such a big effect on why we're literally losing all of our wildlife?
I've spent a lot of time working on protection of endangered species and other species, and it's some of the most fun work I've gotten to do and some of the most satisfying. But it's also somewhat frustrating because very often I realize that the protections we can get is really putting a Band-Aid. We're not addressing the real problem. The real problem often is that our agriculture system is encroaching and often taking over the habitat of these endangered species. We have we have people who want to get rid of the wolves, in large part because we are ranching in wolf territory. In other words, your hamburger comes from wolf territory, and the wolves do what they do, and the ranchers don't like that, so there's pressure on getting rid of the wolves. So these conflicts are largely driven by this vast footprint of agriculture. And agriculture uses 2/3 of the land in the contiguous US, and much of the land in many, many states where there's a lot of habitat, say Western lands, often 60, 70, 80, 90% of the land is transformed by agriculture, leaving very, very little land left for the grizzly bears or the wolves or other animals. So part of it is understanding that the pressure on these species comes from habitat loss, which is largely agriculture. And then what habitat is left is often contaminated by agricultural chemicals. The pesticides, the fertilizers that run off. When you apply pesticides or fertilizers, they don't stay right where you apply them. They often drift onto neighboring land. They land, and then when it rains, they flow into the stream, and then they flow downstream and can poison a lot of that land. So that the impact on the wildlife is not just the loss of habitat because of agriculture, but that remaining habitat is often poisoned by often agricultural chemicals. And then you've got the fact that it's a whole food chain. So, for example, and this is more, I'm jumping into the oceans for a minute, but there's a big growth now of the aquaculture industry. Well, many of the fish that are farmed, and farmed is the wrong word, that are raised in these pens, say salmon, what do they eat? They eat little fish that are sort of vacuumed up from the ocean. But so not only is not that great for the little fish, but that's taking the food that other wild fish would otherwise be eating. But they're essentially their dinner, their prey, is being taken by industrial fishing to be ground up and fed to the salmon in the pens. So you have yet another way that they're losing their habitat is being poisoned, and their food is getting taken from them. So you add all of that up, and agriculture has a tremendous impact on the wildlife and the endangered species that we care about.
Absolutely. And biodiversity and the plant, this is it. This is all we got. Peter, thank you. This was awesome.
It's a pleasure. It's really a pleasure. And Beth, thank you for this great podcast you do.
To learn more about Peter and his work and to learn about Earth Justice, go to our website, speciesunite.com. We will have links to everything. We're on Facebook and Instagram at Species Unite. If you have a spare moment and could do us a favor, please subscribe, rate, and review on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen to podcasts. It really helps people find the show. I would like to thank everyone at Species Unite, including Gary Knudsen, Caitlin Pierce, Amy Jones, Paul Healy, Santina Polkelink, Sierra Dolan, Bethany Jones, and Anna Kalner, who wrote and performed today's music. Thank you for listening. Have a wonderful day.